en este año es una decisión mucho más sofisticada y es la idea de votar para todo menos presidente. O sea, votar por Congreso, por Senado, por cosas, puestos locales, pero no escoger. Y esta es una cosa que entre 1 y 2% de las personas hicieron en el 2016. Entonces, es una amenaza real. Y estos miedos que conocemos súper bien del discurso de la derecha, el efecto que ellos tienen es crear enojo y furia y miedo contra el otro, y el otro puede tomar muchas formas, pero tenemos que entender que su propósito principal es crear una falta de fe en el mismo gobierno. El concepto y la idea de libertad en Estados Unidos tiene un puesto de sumamente importancia cuando nosotros preguntamos a los votantes estadounidenses qué valor más asocian con nuestro país, es libertad. Y esto tiene el puesto más alto y el segundo ni está cerca. Y esto es cierto a través de diferentes grupos, diferentes razas, edades, lugares. Siempre esa idea de que Estados Unidos, nuestro valor compartido es libertad, es súper importante. Algo que quiero señalar en cuanto a esto de cambiar el enfoque de dos diferentes candidatos a dos diferentes futuros, que es muy importante poder hacer, es que cuando nosotros mostramos la agenda, los planes de los republicanos a los votantes, y cuando digo a los votantes, quiero decir incluso votantes republicanos, si no están realmente atados a Trump, odian la agenda. Cada punto en la agenda están en contra. El problema que tenemos es que la mayoría de la gente no se ha dado cuenta de los planes de ellos y cuando presentamos los planes de ellos, la mayoría de la gente está incrédula. Cuando nosotros estamos hablando sobre diferentes emociones que podemos evocar en nuestros anuncios, en nuestros mensajes, nuestras narrativas, entre los sentimientos, las emociones negativas, está el miedo, lo cual entre gente progresista causa un deseo de ocultar, de esconder, de huir en la mayoría de las personas. En muy pocas personas, personas activistas, causa una reacción de querer pelear, pero eso es la minoría. En vez de crear miedo, tenemos que crear desafío, enojo, resistencia.
Since Dobbs, the decision of the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade in June 2022, we've seen a dramatic and immediate impact in the lives of women and other pregnant people across the country, and it's only worsening. We have now 18 out of 50 states that have strict abortion bans, either de facto total bans or in practice total bans, forcing people to travel to access care if they cannot obtain abortion pills by mail, or if they're too far along in their pregnancy, which is more and more people because of the delays the restrictions on abortions are causing. So we're in a very dire situation. On, on elections, what we've seen so far as a result of this is a pretty clear impact on voter turnout. And that is important because of what Anat said, that we have a large group of people in the United States, half of voters, basically potential voters, who don't vote every year. So having more turnout is very important, especially amongst people who are outraged by these measures because they're likely to go Democrat. And with abortion, we've had an issue that's emerging really as decisive at the state level. And all the ballot initiatives since June 2022 have played out in favor of abortion, even in red states such as Montana, Kentucky, and Ohio. And this suggests that a number of Republicans, women most likely, are voting in favor of abortion rights on the ballot initiative, even if they continue to vote Republican on the rest of the ticket. State level courts have played a very key role. Once the federal guarantee of abortion was disappeared, then it became the job of legislature and state level courts to decide the fate of abortion restrictions. There's also been an interesting impact on the Democratic Party itself of all of this. For the longest time, Democrats, to our frustration, were very hesitant and quiet and hedging their bets on abortion. It was true with the Obama administration. It was true with Hillary Clinton. You will remember her famous saying that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? So things are changing. The Democratic Party has realized that abortion is a winning issue. So they're finally being more proactive on reproductive rights. And that's a very important change for us, for all of us working on abortion rights. And the Republicans are running scared. You know, even though they're continuing with this extreme agenda, they're in fact scared, especially, I would say, on in vitro fertilization, which 86% of Americans support. Republicans there have focused on trans children, particularly. That's been the issue is, you know, the whole question of children and transgender identity. They've done this in two ways. One of which has been about the health care that transgender kids should be entitled to, and they've been done this under the guise of protecting children, right? Protecting children from doctors and even, I guess, their parents, protecting them against people who will try to persuade them to transition. But also at the same time, very perversely, Republicans are portraying those very same trans kids as dangers and as threats to other children, and particularly to girls. On our side, if you want to say on the progressive side, it's not mobilizing people to come out. We don't have a unified progressive movement on this, the same way we have on abortion, and we're not seeing it mobilizing progressive voters in the same way. People won't come out on this issue the same way they are on abortion. On the other hand, is that in the US at least, it also seems not to be a very powerful issue for far-right voters in general elections. It's been potent in primaries where a candidate chooses who's going to represent them. And there it has led Republicans often to choose someone who is the most anti-trans candidate they can find. But when it reverts back to general elections, it seems not to play out in favor of Republicans.
This is an agenda that is quite frightening and not necessarily accepted by voters in the movable middle. So understanding this agenda is really important in terms of how to motivate voters to vote against extremism in the US. What's important about this, and the reason why I say the agenda won't end depending on the elections, is these groups have lots of money. And when I say lots of money, I mean billions of dollars. So what does Project 2025 say? No more diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nothing related to affirmative action or efforts of racial equity. It rages against anything quote unquote woke, which is a very popular thing among the DeSantises of the world, critical race theory, and it would strip all equity efforts out of all of the administration. So what this plan is for a president to transform the next administration and all its agencies, places where he would be able to take action without oversight from Congress necessarily, and by executive order. In other words, there are things the president has control over that doesn't have oversight. So they would strip all these kinds of efforts out. The project takes particular aim at the LGBTQ community. HHS would no longer deal with this. All language related to the community would be removed. They want to reverse recent decisions that have extended some worker protections and other things to this particular community. It would be devastating for the LGBTQ community. Women's rights, of course, would be obliterated. Abortion, nationally banned. If they were able to pull that off, that would take legislation. Anything that the federal government does to help sexual health and reproductive rights, including things like contraception, gone. I should have mentioned on the LGBTQ community too, it's very likely that they would go after same-sex marriage. Samuel Alito, one of our justices, has already talked about this. There is precedent in this document for saying that that was a right that should not have been given. In other words, it's just stripping rights, is what I should say. People of color would be profoundly affected because poverty programs and all kinds of other things would no longer be allowed. And the immigration policies in Project 2025 make the past Trump administration look like it wasn't doing anything on immigration. Project 2025 has a massive international aspect to it. In other words, foreign policy would radically change in the United States if the next president were to adopt these things. And I should say that Trump's own plans on his website are very, very similar to everything on Project 2025. So the next administration would essentially start to abandon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in favor of the Geneva Consensus. Any organization involved in supporting abortion, supporting LGBTQ rights, all these things would be reasons for the Trump administration to abandon various institutions. And as I mentioned, the Geneva Consensus and the idea of the family as the basic unit of human society, that would become the reading, and the entire policy basically of the State Department would be anti-abortion, anti-women rights, and anti-LGBTQ rights, and a big shrinking and leaving from the international system. Much of what Project 2025 talks about is lifted out of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's playbook, especially when it comes to, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women's rights, anti-immigrant, obviously with Orban, Christian nationalism with Orban openly talks about. But it's not just the Orban regime. There are a lot of governments that are lining up behind this vision, and they meet at organizations like CPAC, these international conferences, Political Network for Values, and they represent, if they are successful in, taking over enough governments and sort of warping the way politics works, they would be radically changing the post-war system and the agenda of human rights.
For us, there's a clear distinction between national politics and international politics in Brazil. So you can clearly see what is national and what is abroad. And I would like to highlight how in the US, this distinction is not usually quite clear. I mean, what is national, what is international politics is usually quite blurred in the sense that candidates, politicians, and even the press can discuss this kind of things in a more integrated way. So if we look to some of the states that we call the swing states, and they're not usually Democrats or Republicans, depending on each election, they are going to go for one way or another, such as Michigan. This can create a lot of trouble for Biden in the sense that they do have a huge Arabic community, and they already made some clear statements that they are not happy on this kind of things. So in this sense, you can clearly see on the press, on social media, and talking to people involved into politics, how the Gaza massacre and the conflict now in the Middle East can actually change the way people are going to vote, change their behavior on voting, and this can represent, in the end of the day, a lot of bizarre discussions regarding this. Right now, although the election in political science, we say it's usually about economics, it's usually how people are perceiving economics, these elements can also be used as symbolic questions or issues that can push some of the electorate. And I mean, we can mention Mexico, like Sonia just said, there's a lot of discussions regarding migration. Right now, Biden just announced it actually a couple of hours ago that it's going to change some of the politics regarding migration to the US, trying somehow to convince the people who are leaning to Trump but not truly convinced they should go to Trump, that maybe they can push over for Biden. So my argument here is that we should look into the international as a platform where symbolic elements can be used by politicians in the US to address these and other elements. So a lot of crises are quite operant in this moment. And again, this is quite useful because we already had 4 years of Trump, and those 4 years, they did have a huge impact in global South politics and in I would say, wannabe authoritarian leaders in the global South, in Latin America and Africa and other places. And I'd like to highlight two elements that I think we as progressive activists or people looking to academia, to this kind of things, we should be prepared. The first one is symbolic. when the most powerful country in the world elect a far-right authoritarian leader, there is a huge impact across the globe. To look to the US election not only has a national issue and not only has an international discussion, but a transnational, a constellation of actors who are actually dealing with this, from sexuality, from subjectivities of global far right to violence, the role of military will have to play a role on. Will have to take into account these kind of things. Those far right groups, they already understood that they can get quite galvanized by transnational connections. I would say us as progressive somehow will have to address this as a transnational issue as well. So this kind of platforms will have to keep doing, in the sense that, well, probably we'll have to face new authoritarian groups in the future. Thank you.